Hey everyone. In response to the attacks in Israel-Palestine, I wanted to make a report that provides important context that is almost never mentioned in the mainstream corporate media, and yet we cannot understand this conflict without these basic facts. First of all, in Gaza, there are 2.3 million Palestinians living under an illegal Israeli blockade. Israel controls everything that enters and leaves Gaza. This is an open-air prison. Even the former British Prime Minister referred to this as an open-air prison. This has gone on for 16 years and it's completely illegal. Secondly, according to international law, Palestinians have a legal right to armed resistance. Today, I'm going to look through the letter of the law. I'm going to look at United Nations resolutions that show clearly that Palestinians have a right to armed resistance against Israeli colonialism. And three, Israel is a colonial apartheid regime. It used to be controversial to say this, but it no longer is. Even mainstream Western human rights organizations like Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch and UN bodies have acknowledged that Israel is committing a crime against humanity by carrying out a system of apartheid against the Palestinian people. These are all very important facts. I'm going to go through the evidence today from mainstream sources showing this, and yet this context is almost always omitted from mainstream corporate media coverage of Israel-Palestine, which always portrays attacks by Palestinians as illegitimate, or the US government claims the attacks are unprovoked, which is completely absurd. Now, because I'm doing this video on YouTube, and YouTube is notorious for censoring videos about Israel-Palestine that criticize Israeli apartheid, I do have to be a little careful with some of the language and the terms I use. Every time I do a video about Israel-Palestine, the YouTube algorithm always prevents people from seeing it, really pushes down the numbers. And of course, this very censorial environment prevents me as a journalist from being able to fully explain everything in detail. But here are the basic facts that you should know. First of all, the conflict in Israel-Palestine is not about religion. A lot of Western analysts try to portray this as a religious conflict between Muslims and Jews. First of all, there are many Palestinian Christians as well. It's not religious, but this is a lazy analysis. In reality, this is a conflict about national liberation and self-determination. This is also similar to the very lazy and misleading analysis that blames the violence in Northern Ireland on religion. It's not a religious conflict. It's a conflict about colonialism, of Irish nationalists resisting British colonialism so they can unify Ireland, which is partially occupied by British colonialism. It's not a conflict between Catholics and Protestants. Now, because this is a struggle of national liberation, and one nation tends to be largely Catholic and one tends to be largely Protestant, people try to map it religiously, but in fact, it is fundamentally a political conflict like the conflict in Israel-Palestine. It is a conflict about colonialism. Israel as a state was born out of European colonialism. Theodor Herzl, the father of the modern political Zionist movement, which called for the creation of a Jewish state in Palestinian Arab territory, he wrote a letter to the infamous British colonialist Cecil Rhodes, who got rich stealing the natural resources of Africa. And in fact, he had an entire colony named after him, Rhodesia, which is modern-day Zimbabwe. In this letter to Cecil Rhodes, Herzl said that his plan for creating an Israeli state was, quote, something colonial. He referred to it as a European-style colony, which is what it was. And then in 1917, the British Empire issued the Balfour Declaration, in which the British Empire officially endorsed the creation of a European-style colonial Jewish state in Palestinian territory. Again, this is at the peak of the British Empire. Israel has always been a colonial project. Then in 1948, militias from the Zionist movement, which sought to create an Israeli state, they ethnically cleansed hundreds of thousands of Palestinians, kicking them off their homelands in what is known as the Nakba. And today there are now millions of Palestinians in the diaspora who do not have the right to go back to their homeland. This led to the creation of an entire United Nations agency called UNRWA, the UN Relief and Works Agency for Palestine Refugees. And today they have 6 million Palestinian refugees registered. Again, they're not able to return to their homeland because of Western-backed Israeli colonialism. Then in 1967, Israel occupied the West Bank, which is where still millions of Palestinians today live under an illegal apartheid regime of occupation, military occupation by Israeli forces. Israel also occupied Syria's sovereign territory of the Golan Heights, which remains illegally militarily occupied by Israel. And today we're going to be talking about Gaza. Israel also occupied the Gaza Strip near Egypt, and Israel has maintained a suffocating blockade of Gaza. In 2022, UNICEF, the United Nations Children's Fund, published a report on the humanitarian impact of 15 years of the Israeli blockade of the Gaza Strip. And there are a lot of very inconvenient facts in here that I want to go through because, again, they're almost never mentioned in the mainstream corporate media. UNICEF notes that the Israeli blockade was imposed on Gaza in 2007. So now it has been 16 years of a blockade. And this is not just a land blockade. It is also a sea blockade and an air blockade. Israel controls everything that goes in and out of the territory. Gaza has no sovereignty. As UNICEF puts it, Israel has significantly exacerbated previous restrictions, limiting the number and specified categories of people and goods allowed in and out through the Israeli-controlled crossings. Israeli forces have largely restricted access to areas within 300 meters of the Gaza side of the perimeter fence with Israel. So they've surrounded Gaza with a massive fence. And whenever Palestinians protest inside Gaza, Israeli snipers shoot them, including not only peaceful protesters, but also medics, also journalists. The United Nations investigated and found that Israel intentionally shot and in many cases killed Palestinian medics and journalists during massive protests over months in Gaza in 2018 as part of the Great March of Return. UNICEF also pointed out that Israeli forces restrict access off the Gaza coast, currently only allowing fishermen to access 50% of the fishing waters that were allocated to them under the Oslo Accord. So again, violating these agreements that Israel signs. Furthermore, the unemployment rate in Gaza is one of the highest in the entire world, 46.6%. Nearly half of Gazans do not have a job. Among youth, it's even more outrageous. Nearly two-thirds, 62.5% of youth in Gaza do not have a job because Israel prevents them from having an economy. 1.3 million out of 2.1 million Palestinians in Gaza, that is 62%, require food assistance. And that number, by the way, has increased because the estimate's now around 2.3 million Palestinians. And there's only one power plant in Gaza, and Israel constantly bombs it, destroying it, which means that the only capacity that it can reach is 50% of the electricity demand in Gaza, which means that there are rolling power cuts and they average 11 hours a day. So basically, if you live in Gaza, you only have electricity half the time. Meanwhile, nearly 80% of piped water in Gaza is unfit for human consumption, and Israel constantly bombs the water treatment plant, which prevents Palestinians from having water to survive. This is why figures even like the conservative former Prime Minister of the UK, David Cameron, have admitted that Gaza is an open-air prison. This should not be a controversial statement. It is an open-air prison camp with 2.3 million Palestinians trapped under an Israeli blockade. This is one of the most densely populated regions of the world, and yet they're treated like cattle. They're not treated like human beings. In fact, documents from Israel's defense ministry prove that Israel controlled the amount of food that can be imported into Gaza in order to, quote, put Palestinians on a diet, to control their access to food. This was reported on a decade ago in the Guardian newspaper, and they say very clearly, this is, the establishment British mouthpiece, they say, quote, the Israeli military made precise calculations of Gaza's daily calorie needs, according to files the Defense Ministry released. Israel also maintained a list of foods that were permitted and banned from Gaza. Israel calculated the calorie needs for Gaza's population so as to restrict the quantity of food it allowed in. And a diplomatic cable released by WikiLeaks, which is why the journalist Julian Assange is in prison and is facing life in prison. WikiLeaks published a U.S. diplomatic cable that it quoted Israeli diplomats as saying they wanted to, quote, keep Gaza's economy on the brink of collapse. And a human rights organization inside Israel called Gisha said, quote, the official goal of the policy was to wage economic warfare, which would paralyze Gaza's economy. And as an example of the restrictions that Israel imposes, it prevents Palestinians from importing things like coriander and instant coffee. I mean, preventing them from having a basic, dignified life. This is why it is absolutely correct to say that Palestinians in Gaza are living in an open-air prison camp. And because of that, according to international law, they have a legal right to armed resistance. This is spelled out very clearly by the United Nations. There is no ambiguity. And this was stated very clearly in a United Nations General Assembly resolution from 1980, which is Resolution 35/35. The resolution, quote, reaffirms the legitimacy of the struggle of peoples for independence, territorial integrity, national unity, and liberation from colonial and foreign domination and foreign occupation by all available means, including armed struggle. Armed struggle, they emphasize that. And specifically, they're discussing, quote, the continued violations of the human rights of the people still under colonial and foreign domination. And in particular, they mention, quote, the denial to the Palestinian people of their inalienable national rights. So by mentioning the Palestinian people, they're making it very clear. Palestinians have a right to resist colonial domination, the Israeli domination and occupation, quote, by all available means, including armed struggle. Later on, the same resolution strongly condemns all governments which do not recognize the right to self-determination and independence of all peoples still under colonial and foreign domination, and specifically names the Palestinian people, along with several peoples in Africa, because, of course, this was a resolution also condemning apartheid in Africa, which I'll be speaking about in a moment. But it also, this UN General Assembly resolution, quote, condemns the expansionist activities of Israel in the Middle East, as well as the continuous bombing of civilian Arab and in particular Palestinian populations and the destruction of their villages. This is a resolution that was passed in November 1980. And for decades, Israel has continued bombing and blockading and occupying Palestinian territory, displacing Palestinians, bulldozing their homes, starving them. This has gone on for decades with no consequences because, of course, anytime there's a resolution in the UN Security Council, which actually has teeth that could be used to take action against the Israeli apartheid regime, well, the U.S. always uses its veto power in the Security Council, protecting Israel. So this is why, despite the fact that international law clearly states that Israel is constantly violating international law on a daily basis, there are no consequences. And this is also why Palestinians have resorted to armed resistance, which they have a legal right to, according to international law, because they have exhausted all other means of resistance. Anytime they try a peaceful protest, we saw what happened in 2018 in the Great March of Return, where hundreds of Palestinians were killed by Israeli snipers, where medics and journalists were intentionally shot by Israeli snipers.